Welcome to the Hollow Library. Tonight's story is short, very short. You could read it in 10 minutes on your own, and I would encourage you to do that sometime. But first, listen to it. Dagon was written in 1917. Lovecraft was 26 years old. He was broke, largely isolated, living in Providence with his aunts, and writing stories that nobody was publishing yet. He would not find his audience for years. But this story, this small, desperate, first-person confession written by a man who is clearly at the end of something, contains almost everything that Lovecraft would spend the rest of his life trying to say. The narrator is a former prisoner of war. He has escaped his captors on a small boat, drifted for days, and found himself stranded on a vast stretch of dark mud that has risen from the ocean floor, as if something from the deep had pushed it up. He is alone. It is night, and in the distance there is something he cannot yet see. What happens next takes about 2 pages. What it does to him takes the rest of his life. I want to say one thing before we begin. Lovecraft's genius, and I do think it is genius, whatever else he was understanding that the most frightening thing is not the monster. It is the moment after you have seen the monster, when you have to go on living in a world that contains it. Dagon is about that moment. It has always been about that moment. Now, listen closely. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless and at the end of my supply of the drug, which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal indeed was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat, with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastnesses of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished, for there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which, for innumerable millions of years, had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. Then suddenly, I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat, At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god, but soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever, as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink, and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense, slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand. The window, the window. Thank you for listening to the Hollow Library. Lovecraft was 26 when he wrote that. He had published almost nothing. He had no audience, no income from writing, and no real prospect of either. He was living in Providence, largely cut off from the world, writing stories in the middle of the night that nobody was asking for. And in those circumstances, in 1917, he sat down and wrote what is essentially a complete statement of everything he would spend the next 20 years trying to say. The whole Lovecraft project is in this story. Every theme, every technique, every fear. It's all here, compressed into 1,500 words, written by a man who didn't yet know what he was building. Let's talk about what he actually did. The story is a confession. It's being written by a man who is about to die, who has chosen to die. And the first thing he does is ask you not to judge him for the morphine. That's the move. That's the tell. He's not asking you to believe him. He's asking you to understand why a sane man, a man who insists on his own sanity in the first sentence, has been destroyed by something he saw. The horror itself takes about 3 sentences. The thing rises from the water, embraces the monolith, makes sounds, and the narrator goes mad. That's it. Lovecraft doesn't describe it. He gives you scale, vast, Polyphemus-like, and he gives you the reaction, which is total mental collapse. But the creature itself is a blur, a shape, a suggestion of something too large and too wrong to be processed by a mind built for ordinary things. This is the central Lovecraft technique, and he had already figured it out at 26. The horror is not in the description. The horror is in the aftermath. The creature appears for a paragraph. The damage it does lasts a lifetime. The narrator spends years trying to drink himself back to the person he was before. He tries morphine. He tracks down an ethnologist and asks careful, oblique questions about the ancient god Dagon, trying to find some framework, some mythology, some anthropology, some system of belief that would make what he saw fit inside a human category. something he could file away, something that would let him sleep. There is no such category. There is no mythology that covers it. The ethnologist is, in the narrator's phrase, hopelessly conventional, meaning he lives in a world where things make sense, where ancient gods are metaphors and deep-sea creatures are biological specimens and madness has diagnosable causes. The narrator used to live in that world. He doesn't anymore, and there is no way back. That is what the story is about, not the creature, the irreversibility. I want to say something about the ending, because I think it's one of the most perfectly constructed endings in horror fiction, and it almost always gets treated as a jump scare. The narrator has been writing this document for the entire story. He is in a garret. He has already told us he intends to throw himself from the window. The story ends with him hearing something at the door, something large, something wet, something that has found him. And his last 3 lines are, "It shall not find me." God, that hand. The window. The window. What's happening there is not simply that the monster has arrived. What's happening is that the narrator's plan has been overtaken by events. He was going to die on his own terms. A deliberate choice, a last act of agency in a life that had been stripped of everything else. And now even that is being taken from him. The thing has come for him before he could jump. The window becomes not an exit, but a desperate escape. The same window he was calmly planning to use moments ago, now something he is screaming toward in terror. The horror of those last 3 lines isn't the monster at the door. It's the loss of the last thing he had left, the ability to choose how it ends. Lovecraft wrote Dagon the same year the Battle of Passchendaele killed 250,000 men in 4 months for 4 miles of Belgian mud. The same year that poison gas was being used systematically for the first time in human history. Invisible, carried on the wind, entering the lungs and destroying them from the inside, with no defense and no warning. The same year that the scale of what industrialized warfare could do to a human body was becoming clear to everyone. His narrator escapes a German sea raider at the very beginning of the story. The war is the frame. And what he finds in the Pacific is a kind of answer to it, a vision of what the world actually is underneath the surface of human civilization. Ancient, indifferent, populated by things that built monoliths in the deep and worshipped gods of their own long before we arrived, and will be there still long after we are gone. The dream the narrator has at the end of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind is not simply a horror fantasy. It is a description of how the world felt in 1917 to anyone paying attention. The surface had already given way. The things underneath were already visible. The only question was how much further it would go. That is what Lovecraft understood, I think, better than almost any other writer of his era. Not that monsters exist, plenty of writers knew that, but that the monsters are not the exception. They are the baseline. The world we think we live in, the ordered, rational, comprehensible world, is the thin crust. Beneath it is something older and stranger and completely indifferent to whether we survive our encounter with it. Dagon is the first clear statement of that idea. 1,500 words, a man on a mud flat, a monolith, a thing that rises from the water and makes sounds that cannot be transcribed, and then a lifetime of trying to forget, ending at a garret window with something large and wet on the other side of the door. Lovecraft spent the rest of his career building outward from this story. Everything that came after, Cthulhu, the color out of space, the mountains of madness, is an elaboration of what he worked out here in the dark in 1917. The scale gets bigger, the cosmology gets more complex, but the emotional truth never changes. You see the thing, you cannot unsee it. And from that moment on, every ordinary thing, every familiar room, every glass of water, every window, contains the knowledge of what is underneath. That knowledge is the real horror, and it is permanent. Thank you for being here. If this one reached something in you, subscribe and leave a comment. The Hollow Library keeps growing because of you, and there is a great deal more darkness still to come. Until then, do not think too long about what might be at the bottom of the ocean. It has been there longer than we have. It is not waiting for anything in particular, but it is there,